Hello and welcome to this India Today special. The slowdown in the Indian economy is perhaps one of the stories of our times, which is why former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia's book, Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years, couldn't have been better timed. And which is why we are very privileged to be joined by four very special guests to discuss the road ahead and indeed look back and look at lessons from the past for the future. We're joined by former Finance Minister, Mr. P Chidambaram, by Bibek Debroy, Chairperson in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, by Mr. YV Reddy, one of the most distinguished former governors of the Reserve Bank, and by the author himself, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I'm going to start with comments that were made by a former CA not too long ago, Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramaniam, when he suggests that we've entered the great Indian slowdown, that the economy is headed to the ICU and the situation is not too different from the financial crisis of 1991. Is Mr. Subramaniam being alarmist or is he being prescient? And I want you, Dr. Ahluwalia, to take that because in a way, your book starts with 1991 and indeed the story of the high growth years start with 1991. So are we really in a situation that can be compared to 1991?
There's no question that we've entered a period of a very serious slowdown. I think I just said that the lowest quarterly growth rate in the recent times is the 4.5% growth. If you compare that with, let's say, the first 7 years of the UPA, when the growth rate averaged 8.4, I mean, 4.5 is really low. And it's not just the growth. That is why we're not seeing any growth in employment. And the way that affects people is really high rates of unemployment, and especially high rates of unemployment amongst the young. So I call that a crisis. Now, we've had crises before. We've had problem years. Question is, are we in a position, do we recognize that it's a crisis? I mean, this is the first point. If you don't recognize, if you think that you're still on the path to hit 5 trillion in 2024, then, I mean, perhaps there's not much to do. On the other hand, if you feel you're off track, then you really need to decide what is it you're going to do to get back on track. This is the first issue. And I think we are off track, but I feel that the economy has the capacity to get back to a growth rate maybe close to 8%. So we need to spell out what needs to be done to get back to that growth rate.
We'll come to the specific measures that all of you would suggest, but Mr. Chidambaram, the government of the day insists that this is cyclical, this is a blip, and you certainly cannot compare 2020 to 1991, possibly not even to 2007-8. Do you agree that broadly, because this is the other big debatable point, that the government insists this is cyclical, this is not structural, the macroeconomic fundamentals are much stronger than they've been?
Whether you and I like to agree or not, we better agree. Otherwise, there's a danger of being branded anti-national. So having said that for the record, let's come to the truth now.
You could be branded anti-national, not me.
Which means you agree with them most of the time. The point is, Arvind Subramaniam was nearly correct. He said that the economy is in the ICU. I disagree with him in the following manner. The patient was being wheeled into the ICU. The patient has been stopped just outside the ICU and is being looked at by incompetent doctors. There is no aggregate demand rise. Unemployment is rising. Consumption is falling. Credit is sputtering. And yet the government says all is well, which means we'll have to rewrite our textbooks on economics, or these trained economists have to revise their prescriptions for an economy. Every indicator is pointing southward. If every indicator is pointing southward, how can the GDP rise to 7 or 8%? Which is why Arvind Subramaniam said, I don't believe these numbers. These numbers overstate the growth by 2 to 2.5%.
So how do you choose to describe the present situation then?
It's certainly not 1991. In 1991, we had 3 weeks of foreign exchange for our imports. We have today $460 billion, thanks to what we did in 1991, namely repeal FARA and lift exchange control substantially. The situation is bad, not as bad as 1991, but perhaps close to what we found ourselves in 1997, when we pulled back after the Asian crisis. There's Dr. Jalan, who I credit completely with pulling us out of the Asian financial crisis. Dr. Jalan was governor at that time. And I think it's pretty close to 1997. It's also pretty close to 2013, when the taper tantrum took place. Again, we pulled back. So I think it can be pulled back, but you need competent people to pull it back.
Professor Debroy, you're supposed to be one of the competent people who are advising this government. Now, if you read Montek Singh Ahluwalia's book, two things stand out, particularly from that period of 1991. One, there was a clear acceptance. There was no denial that we were in a crisis. And number two, there was a constellation of fine economic minds who were brought together for the process of consultation to bring the economy back on track. And there is a sense at the moment that neither of the two things are happening. The government is still in denial, and the government seems to know it knows best, and therefore encourages no expertise or gets in no talent from the outside to kickstart the economy. Do you agree with this broadly?
Well, Rajdeep, I realize your compulsions of this being on live television. But I don't think we do justice to either the book or the person. If we started off a discussion with Arvind Subramaniam, we are not discussing Arvind Subramaniam's book. We might want to do that, but we are discussing Montek Singh Ahluwalia's book. And Montek Singh Ahluwalia's book, 75% of it, there are a few pages which is an epilogue.
Do you believe that the government of the day is in denial over the state of the economy, A, and isn't bringing in the kind of talented people that Dr. Ahluwalia speaks about that are littered through the book and the first 75%? Do you believe that that is a big difference between the high growth years and what we are facing today?
I do believe we are discussing the book. I do believe the epilogue could have been better written. I do believe that if in the epilogue Montek mentions the Arvind Subramaniam paper, he should have mentioned the critique to the Arvind Subramaniam paper that we authored. I do believe that if he's mentioned railway reforms, he should also mention the reforms that have been introduced. But the epilogue is only about 20-odd pages. Don't reduce this wonderful book to 20 pages. That is my plea to you.
No, I'm not reducing the book. I'm asking you about the challenge of our times, which is what we want to focus on.
So please have
you want to stay away from the challenge of our times?
No, please have a separate debate on that. But do not use the peg of the book.
Okay.
The peg of the book is also backstage. The peg of the book is also about what it took to get the reforms going. Do not reduce it to post-2019. That's not fair to the book. That's not fair to Montek.
It almost suggests, therefore, to me, that you do not want to confront the demons that exist today.
I do, but not using the book as a peg.
Okay.
Let's stick to the book.
Okay.
Don't reduce it, as I said, to the last 20 pages.
Okay. Dr. Reddy, Mr. Reddy, a key element of the present crisis has been the banking crisis, both public sector banks and NBFCs, and Dr. Ahluwalia talks about it. Has the government, in your view, and I'm looking now at the present government in a way, you think, done enough to bring the banking sector back on an even keel? Is the solution, as the government seems to have done at the moment, the recapitalization of banks, bringing together several stressed banks together into one larger entity? Or is it, as Dr. Ahluwalia mentions in the book, the critical factor is making banks and their managements far more autonomous and independent, and indeed recasting in a way both the Reserve Bank and indeed the banking sector?
First, I had said some time back that all over the world, future is uncertain. In India, past also is uncertain. And this, because we get a revised estimates, final revised, re-revised, that keeps happening. And more so, when a chief economic advisor who has produced the statistics goes and within few months, again changes them. So let us admit that we are in a very peculiar position in analyzing this economy. Moreover, I live in Hyderabad, so I think I'm a little away from present. So, but I think more important is 89-91. The book covers, that's
Yes.
what my book covers extensively.
So what are the lessons of 89-91 that you think are relevant to today?
No, let me say, I don't want to say lessons, but let me explain some features which may be relevant. Because in 1989, you mentioned that imbalances, by the time Rajiv Gandhi completed his term, imbalances were built. There were huge imbalances. You are also almost going to IMF. So let's accept 1989, there are imbalances. Then 1991 June, reforms. And you also mentioned the work you did in the Ministry of Commerce even before the reform started in April. So basically we must note this fact. 89, fiscal imbalances. And not only fiscal, imbalances. 91 July, reform starts with a bang. What happened in these 2-3 years? We know that there are political instability, but there was system stability. The system went ahead. And during this period, this crisis was successfully handled. We were only waiting for the election. There was an election. And the ex-Prime Minister was assassinated. And the design, the broad design, it is very, very well known that the thinking behind the reform and the broad design, there was general agreement within the government, by and large, at least at a professional level. So I think we have to note this fact, that the system stability is important. System should be running smoothly. No center-state tensions, no this tension, no that tension. So there are political uncertainties. That's a different matter. I think the system that then prevailing was conducive to some effort. Secondly, there was a sort of a intellectual framework agreed upon among the professionals. By the time 91 came, it's not there was and which persisted during the reform period. So now I think questions we have to ask is, how is it different? Now, so the bigger issues, the system, the center-state relations, the intellectual framework, is there a consistency? I think that would help us take a better hang of the cyclical elements and structural elements. That both of them are present is perhaps undeniable.
Because you, Dr. Reddy, at various stages have suggested that coalition governments in a strange way were perhaps better equipped to deal with such crises than the so-called big majority governments.
No, I didn't say that exactly like that. But again, let me go back to the book, due respect to Bibek. See, in the book also, apart from this period itself, where nothing very serious happened, big problems were solved. That's one example. And second, in a way, even you mentioned, Montek, about Devegowda, Mr. Gujral, things didn't fall apart. Things moved on. Now, there is another example I will say, if I may take the liberty, rather hesitatingly. You take the difference between UPA 1 and UPA 2. UPA 1 had more characteristics of a coalition. UPA 2 had less. I rest my case.
Mr. Chidambaram, since you seem to be the most willing to confront, in a way, the demons that exist today, we can talk about the banking crisis, and Dr. Ahluwalia sort of spends a lot of time in the book on it. But many of these crises originated in the UPA years, especially in UPA 2, the evergreening of loans in the period that led to banks being burdened with NPAs, the accusations, I don't think Dr. Ahluwalia refers to it, but critics of your government at the time had, that PSU bank heads would be rung up by ruling party netas during Dr. Singh's years, that this is all a legacy issue which the NDA is determined to end. In a sense, Dr. Ahluwalia perhaps chose not to go too deep into some of those critiques of the UPA years, but do you accept them now? Since Dr. Singh himself has earlier said today, we must question even the years of the UPA.
Certainly, we must question the years of the UPA. And I think Montek has, when talking about the stimulus packages of 2009, pointed out there were questions about the stimulus package even then. In fact, he says that after Mr. Mukherjee moved to Rashtrapati Bhavan and I came back, he said that I was less enthusiastic about stimulus than Mr. Mukherjee. So we must question it. But you have to question it on the premise of facts. You can't question it on the premise of ghosts. What the present government is questioning the UPA 2 years of 2012, 13 and 13, 14 is based on fake facts. They're not facts. For example, they say there was telephone banking and they prosecuted a whole series of bankers and put them in jail. And now, 10 days ago, the government says we're going to ring fence the bankers. Now, if there was telephone banking and you prosecuted and then virtually brought credit to a halt, no banker wants to lend. They won't tell you that. No banker wants to lend. I've had conversations with senior bankers who I asked them, do you have a big ticket loan on your table today? He will look around and make sure nobody's hearing and come and whisper, sir, I'm retiring in 4 months. So therefore, you bring credit to a halt by intimidating and vilifying and humiliating bankers. And today you want to ring fence bankers. That's not going to spur them to increase credit. Yes, but there was a difficulty here. It was the result of the stimulus package. I have a view which was then different and it was now different from the prevailing wisdom of that day. The first stimulus package was perhaps necessary. The second was arguable. The third was unnecessary. The stimulus package increased the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit and inflation. But we pulled it back. Thanks to the support of the Prime Minister, we pulled it back. And when we handed over the economy in 2013-14, it was growing at 6.3%. So what is the NDA complaining about?
You don't accept, therefore, when the NDA says that they are cleaning up the mess in banks that was left behind by your government.
Well, there are two distinguished past governors here. What is the mess in banks? I asked this question in Parliament of the Finance Minister. You say NPA is a creation of the UPA. I said, fine. Now, please break up the NPAs into 3 categories. Which were the loans given by UPA, which has become NPA? Which were the loans given by UPA, evergreened by your government, which has become NPA? And which were the loans given by your government, which has become NPA within 24 months? There is no answer until today. There is no answer in Parliament until today. Why don't they answer that question and break it up in letters? Does anyone know this breakup? Has this breakup been disclosed to anyone?
You know, Dr. Ahluwalia, one of the sins of the UPA, if I may be allowed to call it a sin of the UPA years that has been heaped in a way on the NDA, which you do speak about rather frankly, is the retrospective tax amendment, which now threatens to cripple the telecom sector as a result of a Supreme Court order. You mentioned in the book that you recommended strongly against it, yet the Finance Minister, Pranab Mukherjee, went ahead with it. He seemed to overrule both you and Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. What does it say about the way the UPA handled critical economic issues in UPA 2? I know that you believe it's unfair to focus excessively on the UPA 2 years and avoid all that happened prior to 2010, 2011. But many believe that these were the mistakes for which we are paying a price today. Do you believe that at that time, Dr. Singh should have put his foot down as the Prime Minister, backed you and others who were saying, the Finance Minister should be overruled on the retrospective tax amendment?
Vodafone amendment and AGR are two different issues.
Yes, but they are linked in a way. It started from there, sir. Go ahead.
Well, let me say, on the Vodafone amendment, as I mentioned in the book, it was my view that that shouldn't have been done. But the system by which budgets are made is not a system where there is collective decision making. I mean, if you have a view, you put it to the Finance Minister. Usually you don't expect the Finance Minister to respond. I mean, this would be true in all budgets, that people say to the Finance Minister, this is what should be done. But because of secrecy, they don't really expect the Finance Minister to tell them whether they're agreeing or not. Nor is the matter discussed in groups. So I have no idea what went on later on, but it's true that I was not in favor of it, and in the end that input was not reflected in the final decision.
Who should have the final word? The Prime Minister or the Finance Minister?
I mean, let me put it this way. I think, having said that, I would not say that, that was responsible for a huge kind of problem. I mean, there are I obviously did not agree with it, but I think if everything else is working okay, in all governments, you do get these kinds of decisions sometimes which worry people. So I wouldn't regard that as something that led to a massive permanent damage to the system.
I'm just trying to look at it from the point I raised with Dr. Reddy just now about coalition governments versus majority governments. As Dr. Reddy suggested, UPA 2 in a strange way was less of a coalition government than UPA 1. And that is where we found with 2G, with auctions of natural resources like coal, the government coming under increasing pressure and questions. Do you believe, in hindsight, that perhaps in a coalition government it's easier or more difficult to handle these kind of pressures?
No, I think, look, they were both coalition governments, so I don't think you can say one was a coalition. The only difference between UPA 1 and UPA 2 was in UPA 1 there was a lot of support from the left from outside. But clearly the UPA 2 was a coalition government, different parties were involved, and that government had to balance off the interests and positions of the different parties. So I don't think there's any doubt that it was a coalition government. Nor can you say that any of the problems you identified are the result of not being a coalition. I don't agree with that view.
Was it the result of... the point I'm making, do you need a strong Prime Minister to drive economic reform? Many believe, and Prime Minister Dr. Singh has given a lot of credit to Narasimha Rao for the reforms of the early 90s. Many give credit to Vajpayee ji for what he did in the early part of the 21st century, and Dr. Singh in UPA 1. Do you believe it's necessary to have a strong Prime Minister to drive economic policy and economic reform?
I think you certainly need a cohesive system. How strong a Prime Minister can be is a function of the politics of the situation. I mean, if you're running a coalition government, the job of the Prime Minister is to keep the coalition together and to make it function in the most effective way possible. So you can't sort of impose a new set of expectations on a different political reality.
Professor Debroy, let me try you again. Let's go back to the epilogue. The charge is that, and in a way, Dr. Ahluwalia makes it in the epilogue, that the NDA seems to look at economic policy today from a rear view mirror. If anything goes wrong, blame it on the UPA, without taking any responsibility possibly for an ill-conceived demonetization, a badly implemented goods and services tax. Is there at least an acceptance that maybe we got this wrong and we need to reform, let's say, for example, GST totally? That if you, and I come back to it, if you really want to take forward reform and get us out of the crisis, we need to face the reality of a slowdown, not live in denial, and accept mistakes that we may well have made, or your government may well have made.
This book is also about Montek and Escher coming back, consciously taking a decision to come back to India. This book is also about several economists who came back, some of whom are present here, who came back at that time without worrying about retaining their green cards. There are people who have come recently who have been much more interested in retaining their green cards and going back. So this is also about what it took a generation of economists then, of whom Montek and Escher are two, who consciously took a decision to come back. This is also about economists who entered the government laterally and managed to exist and work with the malign bureaucracy within government. So there are lessons about that.
Are you saying that generation no longer exists?
How many economists will you now find in India as opposed to economists who are there in the US and have chosen not to come back? Now, to me, this book is also about that.
Why is that? Why do you think that in the
Now, that's the question we should be asking.
No, so I ask you this. Why is it that in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, people of credibility came in, were encouraged? I asked you this earlier, and you had a constellation of fine minds who got together to push the economy towards high growth. And today what do you have? Two RBI governors. One was forced to resign. Another one was virtually sacked. And you've had the chairperson of the Niti Aayog choose to return. What is it? Something obviously is foul in the air that the same credible economists no longer want to work and serve the government. Why?
No.
Why are they rejected? Are they not treated seriously? Or do you believe that it's just a new generation?
You are again reducing it to post-2019. I
am comparing 2019
what I
to
just
the
described
past.
to you, what I just described to you is 90s onwards.
Yes.
How many economists have come back from overseas in the 90s as compared to a bunch of them that you see here, who came back in the 80s, second half of the 80s. You can see Surjit sitting there, Rakesh, I don't know whether he's here, all of these people, Shankar.
So why do you think that has happened? There must be an explanation. Why?
I don't think there's a very simple explanation. If you are looking for a very simple explanation, I would say governments were not welcoming in the 90s. I don't think that's true at all.
Is that true that you found a far more welcoming environment? You came back, what, 1979?
Yeah.
Mrs. Gandhi takes over a year later. You went through various governments. Were governments, prime ministers like Dr. Singh, who sought you out? Of course, then he was in a different position, but even others went out of the way to encourage talent to come and work for government. Today we find talent being driven out of government.
You know, the only institutional change that has occurred is that in those days, the position of economic advisor was a position that was open for competition from outside. And then I think over time what happened is that it got what is called encarded. So economic advisors' positions were filled by people promoted from the Indian Economic Service, and the only economic advisor position as a permanent position where you bring in from outside, recruit from outside, is the chief economic advisor, okay? So the fact that all the economic advisors' positions were open to outside competition did bring a lot of younger people into government. And these were not three-year appointments. They were just appointments in government. They had no guarantee that they would make progress if they weren't found fit for higher positions. But it created an avenue for people from the profession to come in. That changed, mainly because I think of internal civil service sort of pressure. And I think there's a valid, the Indian Economic Service had a valid point. I mean, as a first-class service, they argued that the logic of a first-class service is that 15% of the jobs for the service should be at the Joint Secretary level. But the economic advisors' jobs, which were Joint Secretary level jobs, were not encarded for the economic service. Now, I don't know whether that's a factor or not a factor. But today, a 40-year-old person cannot get into the government. They can get in for three-year appointments, but they cannot get into the government on a sort of permanent basis saying they want to come in. That's an important issue.
Dr. Reddy, in the 90s, the opposition to to reforms that was pushed at one level by politicians, by a group of industry, by a few bureaucrats, was overcome in a way because of leadership and also the nature of the crisis. The crisis was just so overwhelming that you desperately needed reform. Do you get a sense that in India, given the resistance from the bureaucracy in particular at times to change, you need a crisis to bring about reform? In that sense, where we stand today actually gives us a great chance to reform. We've already seen with the insolvency and bankruptcy code, the crisis in the banking sector leading to a positive change. Do you believe that it's important in a strange way for India to have a crisis to actually reform faster?
I will come to that question, but I'll answer a question which you didn't ask me. See, why is it that many economists came at that time and not subsequently? Maybe because the people who invited them, like was Manmohan Singh, he called them. Almost all the names you mentioned, Bibek. So maybe the way they are invited, the way they are treated, also important. So that is one part. And second is the issue of whether there is need for a crisis or for reform. I thought there was an answer a little before where they said you have to accept a problem before you reform. So what is the problem? So that is the issue now. So if you say that there is a problem, then there is need for reform.
Do you believe that there is a serious crisis? Professor Debroy won't answer it. You have Mr. Chidambaram claiming that it's a patient who's been stopped just before the ICU and is being handled by incompetent doctors. How do you see it?
As I said, I'm not very up to date, and fortunately I'm in Hyderabad. Yes.
No, actually being in Hyderabad gives you a huge advantage.
Yes.
Because you have a better view than those sitting in Delhi.
No, not a better view, more objective view.
More objective view, exactly.
And there is also another.
So what's your objective view?
There is another reason why I'm a little more objective than some, because I spent only 8 years in Delhi. I worked most of my career in Hyderabad.
That's right.
So from a common sense point of view, if I may say so, in the Indian economy, the growth is a little less, or is it little or how more, less than what it was before. So you may call it slowdown, no slowdown, but numbers are less than what they were before. I think that's one, that we accept. Second, I think financial sector, there is a problem, I think, which has not yet been overcome. Something is being done. On the fiscal side, I think even the Comptroller Auditor General, some issues have come up. And then there is also the issue of employment, which is coming up with the figures. So I think there is enough independent, not magnitudinally precise, but the things are not that comfortable. So it's not only, so therefore, I think there must be something structurally wrong, or rather structurally something should be righted. So, and I think there one thing I want to add, it's not as though the government, from what I understand, the government is not denying the need for reform. The government is doing the reform in the way it thinks it is right. That's a matter which we can debate. So what I want to say is that we should now broadly say that we are in difficulties. I think we should accept that. How difficulty? Some reform is being done. We should all work together to make sure that things improve. So we have to concentrate a little more on what is to be done, what's being done, what's right, what is wrong. Then, I think there is broad admission. I don't think anybody denies. Bibek, will you deny that there is a slowdown compared to the past?
Of course, there's a slowdown. That slowdown to something that happened in 2019, that is debatable. Now, so far as the question of reforms is concerned, it depends on the definition of reform. But I will link it to a question that Rajdeep asked you, didn't ask me, so let me volunteer to answer that question. I think this proposition that you require a crisis to reform is somewhat questionable, and let me explain why I mean by that. The sole evidence for that I can see is what happened in 91. Now in 91 also, it is not that there wasn't an alternative. It would not have been a very desirable alternative, and Montek himself mentions a paper which certain left-wing economists had put out, probably reaction to them, document 91, I think. I think the more pertinent question to ask is, there are reforms which pertain only to the external sector. And there are reforms which pertain to the domestic economy, several of which under the 7th schedule are state subjects or in the concurrent list. Montek will remember that in 93, the Department of Economic Affairs brought out a paper called 2 Years After the Reform and the Way Ahead. If you sat down with that paper 2 years after the reform and the way ahead, you would find that many of the items listed in that paper as second generation reforms continue to be on the agenda for reforms today as fifth generation reforms. The reason for that is what I just said. The political economy of domestic reforms is much, much more difficult. It concerns the states. We are talking about factor markets, most of which are state subjects. It is not as simple as devaluing the currency in a situation of an administered exchange rate or reforming purely trade policy. Because if you look at 91, except for industrial delicensing, it was essentially trade policies, which are always similar.
You know, in a sense, picking up from that, and you mentioned this in the book, that this journey of reform has often been done through stealth. You use the word gradualism. You know, some would call it incrementalism, but it's been done often through stealth, or it's been done in a crisis. And then we've seen, whether it's FDI and insurance, or indeed yet another attempt to sell off Air India, that it takes years, it takes decades before you actually get to the point where you've achieved an element of reform. So, I mean, given the complex nature of our political economy, given the fact that states are much more assertive, given the fact that we have so many more political parties today, is it more difficult, you think, today to achieve reform, or easier?
Well, I think the reforms that we now have to do are deeper and more complex, okay? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them.
Give me examples.
Well, okay. Let's take, for example, how do you fix the problem of the banks? Globally, most people think that when you have a problem with public sector banks, you need to reduce the role of the government. I happen to believe that that is so. Many years ago, I think it was Bimmel who said we ought to bring the government share in public sector banks below 33% or something. And the then Finance Minister, Yashwant Sinha, said, yes, we must do that. But that very government wasn't able to get it done, because within the party, politically, it was not easy. So I think you can't just expect to do it by stealth. You have to take the issue head on. You know, more recently, P.J. Nayak, and I mentioned that in the book, P.J. Nayak had suggested that, okay, if for some reason there's a political problem, and you don't want to go below 51%, the important thing is to get the finance ministry out of the functioning of the banks, set up some kind of a holding company, put the government share. You'll need some legislative amendments, but that's easy to do. Put the government shareholding in the holding company, make sure that the holding company is run by a true professional and not by bureaucrats, and then let that holding company appoint the chief executives of the banks, not have it as a political appointment. Now, you know, it's not the same thing as reducing the share of government below 51%, but it's a substantially different approach. We need to see whether something like that would work. We also need to, and this has been brought up many times, the Reserve Bank of India, public sector banks are subject to dual regulation. They're subject to regulation by the Finance Ministry and also by the Reserve Bank of India. As a result, neither of them do a good job. Now, my personal view is this should end. We should, in fact, get the Finance Ministry out of the business of exercising supervision over the public sector banks, make whatever legislative changes are needed, and fully empower the Reserve Bank of India to give it the same power vis-a-vis public sector banks which it has vis-a-vis private sector banks. I mean, in the case of the private sector, if the RBI feels that the chief executive should be removed, they can remove him. They can't do that for the public sector. As a result, the RBI has a perfect excuse that, look, we can't do anything. So we need to face this. We need to go up politically and say we're going to do it and just do it. In my book, what I've suggested is, why don't we experiment? Take half the public sector banks and put them in the PJ Nayak mode, and the other half can carry on the way they are, and 10 years later we'll see which ones do better. I mean, this would be a sort of Abhijit Banerjee type of experimental economics, which would be quite useful. Now, I think if you don't do any of this, and all you do is you take 10 unreformed public sector banks and merge them into 4 unreformed public sector banks, you cannot call that banking reform. But that's what's happening at the moment.
You know, while you applaud that, Mr. Chidambaram, let's be honest. Many of these decisions are tough to actually implement when in government. You know, there are, in UPA 1, when you had the left, for example, as your ally, it became virtually impossible at times to take some of these tough decisions. To take off from what is being suggested, in a complex political economy like ours, how easy is it to actually go ahead and initiate these reforms in a true spirit of bipartisanship? I mean, you need genuine bipartisanship in a way to actually be able to implement these reforms.
Many things are being done today after throwing out bipartisanship. So don't bring in bipartisanship when it comes to reform, and when doing the wrong things, the opposition is mocked at and abused and disregarded. So keep that aside. Dr. Manmohan Singh's government had 145 in his party in UPA 1 and 206 in his party in UPA 2. We didn't have a simple majority. We had to scramble for a majority. And every time there was a critical vote, we had to run around finding support. Whereas the government today has 303 on its own in 2019 election. I wish that at some point of time between 1991 and 2014, a Congress-led government had an absolute majority. We never had that majority.
Are you saying it's easier for an absolute majority government to bring in reform than a coalition government, despite the experience of 91-97?
But 91-97, we did not have a majority. Mr.
That's what I'm saying. And yet reforms were brought in a manner that majority governments fail.
There's a logical error in your statement. Coalition governments brought about reforms does not mean single-party majority governments cannot bring about reforms. In fact, my argument is, if you have 303 people on your side and 353 people with your supporting party, it is much easier to push through difficult reforms. Now, that is what the Prime Minister should be doing now.
Can I ask you, though, Link, while you praise Dr. Singh and the way he handled the economy in UPA 1, why didn't your party, though, the Congress party, give him greater credit? You know, there was a sense that by 2014, you wanted to distance yourself from the Manmohan Singh legacy in a way. I mean, Montek Singh Ahluwalia mentions how between 2006 and 16, the maximum number of people were lifted out of poverty. I never heard the Congress in its 2014 political campaign even mention that once. I just wonder at times whether reform itself has not been effectively politically sold, that political parties are still reluctant, even on Air India. I just wonder at the end of the day whether the Prime Minister will actually eventually be in a position to take credit, given that the Swadeshi Jagran Manch in this instance of the BJP will perhaps criticize it, or Dr. Subramaniam Swamy will go to the court. I ask you, even in your years, was there a reluctance in general to give credit for reform-oriented leaders?
Not speaking personally.
Yes?
Certainly not. I mean, I tried my best to take credit for reforms that we had done and reforms that we intended to do.
I'm talking about your party.
I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong to say that the party was distancing itself from Dr. Manmohan Singh. But I agree with your second observation that the party did not capitalize on its achievements in those 10 years and didn't take it to the people effectively.
Okay, so that's at least an admission.
Yeah, that part I agree. The party machinery had become weak. The party machinery was not geared to take the message of the reforms and the successes we had achieved, including lifting 140 million people out of poverty to the masses. We failed to do that. We succeeded to some extent in 2009 election, but we didn't succeed in the 2014 election.
Let me end therefore with you, Mr. Chidambaram, because in a sense you've been a fellow traveler of Montek Singh Ahluwalia through this period post 1991. And I'm going to ask you, Mr. Chidambaram, a large part of this book is about years in government. You're now in the opposition. Is it much easier in a way to look at the economy from an opposition perspective than when you're in government? I mean, you know, in the opposition, you can criticize Nirmala Sitharaman, you can criticize Prime Minister Modi. When in government, the challenges are multiple. We've seen it with the bloated fiscal deficit that you had to deal with in the second part of the UPA 2 years. Is it much more difficult, in a sense, to be in government than be in opposition today? If you were Nirmala Sitharaman, what is the one piece of advice, therefore, that you would give her?
Please resign.
You see, that's precisely it. It's very easy. Very
you
easy.
asked me for one piece of advice, but you asked me what I would advise her. I mean, leave that aside. You see, sitting in the opposition and doing other things. So I was a lawyer in opposition.
Yes.
So other people are writers, economists, teaching, whatever. You get a much better outsider's point of view of the government. But sitting in the government, you can correct it. I'll give you one example. When I joined the Ministry of Commerce, Montek was my first Commerce Secretary, and he will bear me out. We had a post called Chief Controller of Imports and Exports. Now, I had met that gentleman about 3 months before the UPA 1 was, Narasimha Rao's government was voted into power on a flight. And he introduced himself, and I introduced myself, and we were chatting. He's a very good man, very good man. He's doing excellent work today in some other very, very useful field. Now I asked him, I can understand why you are the Chief Controller of Imports. Now please tell me, why are you the Chief Controller of Exports? Who's controlling exports in this country? And why are you controlling exports? Now I added, tongue-in-cheek, if I become Commerce Minister, I had no idea that I will get elected and become Commerce Minister. The first thing I will do is abolish your post. And that is precisely what Montek and I did when we joined the Commerce Ministry. We abolished that post and said we will now call it the Director General of Foreign Trade. Therefore, there is a way of, why did I make that statement? Because I had done so many cases on import and export, and I knew that Red Book had to be made a bonfire of. And exactly we did that. We didn't do a literal bonfire, but we did a virtual bonfire. We burnt that Red Book and wrote a 100-page export policy. My mandate was you cannot exceed 100 pages. And we kept it to 99, and the 100th page came to half a page. So you can do things in the government which you can't do outside. You can only criticize outside the government. Well, what can I do now? I can only write my Sunday column.
And ask for the finance minister to resign.
Yeah, you asked me for advice. You asked me for advice. I didn't offer it or volunteer it.
To the author himself. When are you going to persuade, now that you've got it all off your chest, when are you going to persuade Dr. Singh finally to write his memoirs? When is that moment? Are you going to be able to persuade him? I've attempted a couple of times unsuccessfully. Are you finally going to be able to persuade the former Prime Minister to tell it all?
Well, as I've written in the book, I've tried often, and I promise to continue trying. Whether I'll succeed or not, only he can tell.
Dr. Singh, now that, is that a no? That's a no, I'm afraid. But on that wonderful note, you brought to light a critical period in this country's post-independence history, Dr. Ahluwalia. Thank you very much for doing that. Dr. Reddy, Your vantage point from Hyderabad is thoroughly objective. Professor Debroy, you didn't take every question, but you slowly but surely warmed up. And Mr. Chidambaram, I think you smile much more when you're in the opposition than when you're in government, which is a good sign. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kamal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.